a consultancy and principally an engineering consultancy, I guess what we're about is trying to work towards solutions in the design work and the urban design, building design and everything we do. As I say, to try and come up with solutions and actually steer us towards a more sustainable path. The challenge of doing that is obviously absolutely massive. But hopefully with some of the slides I'm going to show you this morning, it may give you some ideas of how to approach some of that in your design work. And I've also then got some slides on a particular example of a city we've been working on master plans for over the last couple of years in China for a client there who sort of sees has got some views on the future and sees that China needs to head down a different path, and this is the approach that we've developed for them. The first few slides I've called Beyond the Buildings. My degree when I was at Northumbria was building services, mechanical engineering, so I've always had a sort of a great interest in low energy design. But since leaving the university and working at ARUP, I sort of realised that yes, we do buildings very well now. When they are done well, they are very good. Very low energy, fantastic levels of daylighting, etc., etc. However, the scale of the issues and the scale of the problems that Bob's spoken about this morning mean that we need to be thinking about things beyond just the buildings. And whilst, as I said, when an integrated design process works well, and the architects and the engineers and the structural engineers work together well on a building, that's great. What I see in my experience is that when you sort of move upstream from that, in terms of planners and master planning architects and others working together, that process isn't as integrated as certainly as it needs to be if we're going to start achieving more the kind of levels of resource efficiency and more sustainable approaches to planning our cities and designing and building new urban areas. So, as I say, in terms of buildings, and this slide is sort of showing really a framework that we use when we're talking about buildings in particular. So, for buildings, things like designing now for low and zero carbon energy technologies, reducing water use, making buildings more adaptable to climate change by introducing more thermal mass so we can use passive cooling, etc., etc. We do that stuff quite well. The challenge that I see is how we take that, as I say, beyond the buildings to other areas. So, building techniques and getting mass and getting the daylighting and all of that working in a good design team doesn't work well. Bob also mentioned that sort of legislation will increase. We've got the Energy Performance Directive coming out of the UK, coming out of the European Union, and the need now for all buildings to have energy performance certificates. And there's also now the code for sustainable homes. What I'm nervous about in building terms is that design teams, clients, and other people think, right, I've got my energy performance certificate, I've got my code level 6 house, that's it, job done. In terms of sustainability, yes, these things are great, will force great sort of strides in the right direction, but they don't cover the full spectrum of what sustainable development is all about. So I'm nervous, as I said, that people will think, yeah, I've got my certificate, I've got my code level 6 house, that's it, I don't need to do anything more. And they don't think about all the other lifestyle issues to do with where our food comes from, where people, how many miles people drive, the kind of cars they drive, and all those sort of things. So, it's dangerous just to think that you've done what the legislation says and that's it. And as part of that, I think, as I say, we need to think about more than just the building. So, buildings in the middle there, but we need to think about the issues around them, that sort of the local, regional and global scale. Whether that's in sort of terms of local scale, where the water supply comes from, thinking about energy use and use of renewables and the impact of that on the wider environment outside our buildings. Regionally, the effect of what we're doing our towns and cities and buildings on the sort of macro climate and water resources at the sort of the river basin scale. And globally, of course, the big global issues that we're facing to do with climate change and our need to be able to adapt our urban environments and buildings over time and mitigate our impact on climate change. Issues such as fossil fuel depletion and other things to do with social issues like poverty and the ever-increasing threat of war for resources, fossil fuels and water supplies. And as you know, this sort of rather sort of linear process, I think, of urban design has led to a whole series of issues, whether it's people sat, as I've seen in Moscow, people sat in their cars for 2 hours because they haven't been able to have a car for the last 50 years and now they can afford one. They're prepared to sit in a traffic jam in Moscow for 2 hours on the way to work, and they're prepared to sit there for another 2 hours to get home again because they can own a car. It's led to fragmented communities, water scarcity, environmental pollution. So all those kind of issues that were mentioned earlier today are really a consequence of a very unsustainable approach to urban design. So the challenge, as I said at the bottom there, is really how can we change what we do now and make things better and start moving towards a more sustainable world. I think, again, over the last 15, 20, 25 years, maybe more, sort of urban design and architecture has been more based around, I mean, this is a huge generalisation, I accept, but it's more based around sort of the visual aspects of architecture, what the buildings look like, and there hasn't necessarily been a sort of deeper understanding of sort of the impact of the buildings and the people and the process of those actually on the planet. So we kind of need to rediscover that, the impact of us as humans on the planet and design and act accordingly. I say rediscover because it isn't really new, and Corbusier back in the 30s had sort of seen the future in a way when he stated then that trains, Pullmans, metros, cars, roads, and the administration of it all, the personnel required to run it, maintain it, repair it, and police it, that is the stupid waste of modern times. So he was sort of seeing, the motor car and other forms of transport are heading our way, and that's going to be one of the huge problems that we face. Just sort of by way of background, really, to say that we do need to be doing things better and more cleverly and in a more integrated way. And we need to do that. Whilst we're doing that quite well for building design, in our master planning and sort of urban design, we need to be doing those things better. And I'm just going to run through the kind of process that we try and apply when we're working on these broader scale projects. I guess a key issue from the outset is to define what sustainability means for your project. Sustainability for us working on a project in the West End of Newcastle is completely different for us working on a project in China or Russia where levels of poverty and everything are completely different. So we need to understand that each project sits within a context. There's the global role, as I said, to do with sort of climate change and resource use, national role. There's a series of natural constraints that any project faces, and there are also issues to do with just the local character and capabilities. And by capabilities, I mean things like when we're going to China to design and build eco-cities, we're often talking about people making a step change almost overnight in the way they approach and build buildings and everything else. And you need to build capacity within building industries in countries if they're going to change what they do now. So you need to do things really within the context of what the local people, the local building industry, local materials, and everything else can supply. Key to this really is agreeing and understanding your client's vision. What is it they are trying to achieve in their project? Do they just want business as usual and to meet whatever the local building regulations say? Or do they want to be at the far end and to be a global market leader and really pushing the boundaries of sustainability in their design? And depending where they want to be, our use of what we call a sustainability framework will either be something that sort of sits separate and you have a vision and lots of rhetoric, as Bob was talking about, to do with sustainability that gets stuck on the shelf and never looked at and thought about, or you actually have a series of objectives and targets and a design process that really is about sustainable design, and it actually underpins everything that the project is about. And it's really key to get that vision out with the client. Sometimes they'll say all the right words, but when it comes to it, they're not prepared. They won't give you the leadership to make the kind of changes and support the kind of design decisions and the difficult things that you might need to do. So I guess, as I said there, in this approach, in this sort of more integrated approach to urban design and city planning, the key issue really is to broaden and blur the problem boundaries. Often the disciplines, whether it's the architect, the engineers, the civil engineers, structure, the bridge designers, the transport engineers, we tend to work in our silos and work in our disciplines. And sustainability, if nothing else, needs people to think outside what they do, what their discipline is about, and the impact of their discipline on other things, whether it's the environment, the need for materials to come from various parts of the world, and what have you. So it's about thinking more broadly than just your discipline, and properly integrating what you do and taking on board the other parts of the design system. So what I sort of brings here, this is a tool that we use within ARUP to help us improve the sustainability of projects, and if nothing else, it sort of acts as a checklist of issues grouped, as you can see there, under environment, natural resources, societal issues, and economics. So I've just sort of picked on the energy theme there, that as the guy that's developing the energy strategy, what you're doing will have an impact on all those other issues, whether it's the environment, other forms of natural resources, society, and the economics, how much the energy costs, and how much people will have to pay. It's of course a hugely complex area, and any one sort of part of sustainable urban design, urban planning, impacts and interfaces with a whole range of other issues. As I've sort of drawn a bit of a spider diagram on the left, the key really is to identify what the main linkages are that will actually give us a more sustainable, better environment to live in. And once we've identified those sort of key linkages, to then start to design forward. So I've pulled out a few key ones here to do with. I'll just pick on one, the green one, to do with transport, health, air quality, and land use. And basically, there, when we're designing sort of urban areas, if you can get the land use right, so you actually start putting people's homes close to where they work, that then reduces their need for transport and their need to drive miles each day. That can improve air quality because there's less pollution going out to the atmosphere, which then improves people's health, etc., etc. So, a key step is to start identifying some of those key linkages between the main issues that we face in urban design, and actually, physically design towards achieving those things. So this sort of notion of developing a sustainability framework for our projects, it's all about, really, as I said at the top there, trying to develop a more evidence-based approach. A lot of urban design, we sort of kick off, the architect has some grand vision of what he wants things to look like. The other engineering disciplines and people support and just plug into the gas network and the electricity network and what have you, and you kind of end up where you're going to end up. What I'm talking about here is actually deciding where it is you actually want to be in terms of energy use and materials and recycling and how you deal with the waste and everything else, and actually design more positively towards it. So as I said, the key to that really is having a vision. You know, what is it that the client wants to achieve? Is it business as usual, or is it global, an eco-city, sustainable city? Excepting what says that sustainable city is probably an oxymoron, but that's what we're aiming for. It's then about identifying a key series of objectives that underpin that vision, and here I've called out some environmental ones. The fact that you potentially will be designing for climate change, local healthy food, more sustainable and healthy lifestyles. You want to avoid pollution. Again, sort of very strategic objectives. And the key then is to then start identifying particular targets and things that you're going to design for. To do with energy efficiency and where the energy comes from, how much water you want each building type to use, designing for good air quality. All of those things don't happen by accident. They happen in a good way if designers and the design team at the outset start designing to achieve those, or start designing to allow people that live in these places to achieve those things. So by having this sort of sustainability framework of the vision and the objectives and targets and indicators, and then the actual strategies, that really provides a mechanism that starts forcing the different teams to start integrating their work together. So in the same way that, as I mentioned at the beginning, in building terms, the architect and the services engineer and the structural engineer need to work together to get the building to work. The broader urban design team need to be working together. So the ecologist needs to speak to the landscape architect, who needs to speak to the guy who's doing the water flooding strategy, who needs to speak to the landscape architect and the main architect. It's identifying those key links and making sure those people are integrating their work. And having this sort of more systematic approach can really help with that. I mentioned the need for indicators and targets, and picking up the energy theme again. It's about setting out those key performance indicators. Bob mentioned the need across Europe for reducing energy use by 50%. Again, that doesn't happen by accident, and if we continue to build buildings like we do now, and then put people's workplaces sort of 20, 30 miles away, energy use isn't going to go down. People are going to get in their cars and drive there, regardless of how energy efficient their homes are. So it's sort of this holistic approach in setting targets and things that we can measure throughout the design process. And then having mechanisms by which we can evaluate what we're doing as we're producing these sort of designs, and measuring them to make sure that they are likely to perform in the way we want them to perform. So just really in summary of the sustainability sort of framework, this idea as a management tool, it's about identifying key issues, setting out the client's grand vision and a series of objectives to underpin that, setting out a series of targets and performance indicators, and then developing the actual, the master plan, the strategies, the energy strategy, water strategy, ecology, landscape, all of the other things that make up our cities, and then making sure that you evaluate and check the performance of this as you go to continuously try to improve. So in terms of that process, this comes from a new town or a fairly large town, a small city we're looking at the master plan for at the moment, just outside Moscow. And it's for several 100,000 people that, because of the pressure on Moscow at the moment, it's just grinding to a halt. So the planning department of the Moscow Oblast are looking to have a new series of towns around Moscow. So when you sort of start off out on the left-hand side there, you're kind of looking at a scale of 1 to 500,000 sort of maps and what have you. So very, very high level. But as the design process goes on, your scale changes, and eventually you get down to actually designing the buildings and the roads and the bridges and everything else. And the key is that the vision stays constant throughout that. The objectives and targets can be iterated as you go. And the sustainability framework needs to evolve as you go as well. So at the outset, you'll sort of talk targets at a very broad strategic level. By the time you get down to sort of designing the city plots and the buildings, you're then into sort of urban design codes and sustainability guidelines and what have you. The key really is to make sure that that process sort of works and stays in place, because often, certainly in the UK, you sort of work through the first 3 or 4 stages. The vision is held, it then goes into in for planning. Goes in as a planning application, planning submission, and then the sort of client loses his bottle, and everything just defaults back to what the building regulations say you have to do as the bare minimum, and we sort of end up with business as usual development. So, while the regulations and the building regulations and everything else are not really at the same level that we need them to be, they're not as robust as they need to be to hit the kind of sustainable design levels that we need, then you need a client that's really got effectively the balls to hang on to his vision and say, no, I do want 100% renewable energy, I do want this, that and the other, and is prepared to pay and what have you and do it. So that's quite key, and at the moment things do fall apart in those later stages. So just to quickly run through how that might work, and as an example, I'm looking here at the example of climate change, which is obviously a huge issue and should be an issue on anybody's sustainability development or sustainable development agenda. In terms of objectives, you are likely to have objectives under the 4 themes of the environment, natural resources, society and economics, because climate change will affect and is affecting all of those areas. But ultimately they can really be summarised into your need for a mitigation strategy. So whether it's a building or a new piece of city, you should be mitigating your impact, so reducing carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And you should be thinking about designing for how that building or that city or that new town or that part of the city will adapt itself to increasing storminess, increasing temperatures, sea level rise, whatever it is that affects you in your particular area. And of course there's business case for doing these things, or certainly if you face the risk of not taking it on board. In terms of how the master plan responds, in terms of mitigation, yes, it's all about your energy strategy and low and zero carbon energy sources. Transport particularly, not just in terms of the emissions of the vehicles, but fundamentally reducing the need for people to travel. And in terms of adaptation, it's, as I said, things like designing for more severe weather patterns and thinking about what that means for your buildings and people like the young and the old who are particularly sensitive to extremes in weather. I think historically we've tended to stop at that point. The master plan's drawn, we've got some fantastic drawings of where the buildings and the roads and everything is going to go, we get planning application and then off it goes and it gets built. And what we forget that after that, when this new town, city, whatever it is actually being operated, people are fundamentally living their lives there, that the whole governance strategy and the way that these places are operated and run needs to change too. We can't continue to govern our cities in the way that they have been if we want them to be operated more sustainably. So really it's important to think about how this new area of master plan is going to be governed and run at the time you're designing it, and start making sure the local authorities understand what's really heading their way and how they're going to need to change things. And that happens whether it's, as I say, in the West End of Newcastle, where we're dealing with the city and talking to them about adopting new systems for drainage and sustainable urban drainage systems, or whether it's a whole new city in China and the local authority in Shanghai thinking, bloody hell, how the hell are we going to look after this and even deal with the planning application, let alone anything else. The governance issue and how these places are more sustainable cities and towns are run and governed is a key issue. Again, another quick example in energy terms, how it might run. So in terms of the energy strategy, you may have an objective, quite a sensible one, to actually maximise the use of renewable energy resources after you've done everything you can to reduce the need for energy. So the target may be something like, say, a 50% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions from business as usual now, plus the ability to continue to reduce your CO2 emissions over the next 20, 25, 30 years. Now that's only going to happen if you design in the adaptability and flexibility to allow those things to happen. And then looking at indicators, and then the implementation strategy of whether it's combined heat and power or wind or some other renewable technology. So a very simple process, but often it just doesn't happen. We just default at the moment just to plug it into the national grid and doing business as usual. That's developing an energy strategy on dwell on that. In other sort of areas, just to talk through other sort of examples, how you might develop a sustainable energy strategy. There's got to be something about employment, right? People need jobs where they're living, so you may have some targets or goals in terms of your master plan to make sure that there are opportunities for employment, and it's not just about single use, just homes and sort of leisure. And then you want a local economy that can respond to change and provide the other sort of target that I mentioned there, provide a range of attractive and affordable housing opportunities. So, those are the kind of goals or targets that you might set yourselves, and then it's how the design team you set out and produce sort of strategies to make sure these things happen. Same with water. Targets probably to do with reducing the use of water, so more efficient use. We should be more efficient in its use. And also looking at alternatives to just taking the water out of the water main, because every litre of water has an energy component for its treatment and pumping and what have you. So strategies that look at reuse of collection and reuse of rainwater and just reducing how much we use. And then coming back to the governance issue. As I said here, for the Moscow project, in the early days of that, we already raised the issue of governance to our client, and the fact that they will need to develop new governance strategies to develop or to run this new part of the city in a particularly rapid way, but in accordance with the Sustainable Development Principles. In terms of assessing performance now, we've got tools over the last sort of 5-10 years that have developed massively and are very complex, and we're able to look at sort of the interactions of the various parts of the city system, if you will, and look at sort of resource flows between the different areas, whether it's energy, water, people, how the buildings are built, etc., and start putting metrics and numbers to these things. Bob mentioned earlier the concept of ecological footprinting, and we can now be using that actually as a design tool. So you can develop a baseline for sort of business as usual. What would a person living in any country normally consume? And then what we need to do in terms of sort of master planning and design and land use to start reducing their use of resources. So looking at a range of cities and countries, we go again sort of what cited some examples earlier. We go from sort of the likes of China at the moment, where on average, albeit it's changing rapidly, an average citizen at the moment is living within their sort of fair share of resources, all the way through to on the right-hand side of the scale, people in Houston in Texas, because of their urban density and houses are so spread out, everybody needs to get in a car or even to go and buy a newspaper. They're got an eco footprint per person of 12 hectares. So the fair share of resources is between 1.8 to 2 hectares. So if everybody lived on the planet like they do in Houston in Texas, we would need 6 planets to live on. So having these tools actually in the master planning process, because it breaks down the footprint into the effective land area needed for food and for housing and for transport, we can actually start looking at different land uses, how much housing, how much industrial, how much office space, how much area given over for food production, etc., and start changing things around in the design process to make sure that we can reduce the likely global eco footprint of the people who will be living in this new development. We've sort of worked with a series of experts in the firm, whether it's our master planners, urban designers, our energy experts, and what have you. We've kind of worked out this approach over the last sort of few years, really, in response to our clients' demands for sort of more sustainable design. But there's nothing, in a way, there's nothing new. There's sort of this technique of backcasting, when you, rather than just predicting where you're going to go and sort of ending up there, but this technique of backcasting when you actually decide where it is you want to go and then work backwards to say, right, what do we need to design, what systems do we need, etc., to make sure that we get to where we want to go, is a recognised system. And there are other very useful pieces of work and publications and technical papers from centres like the Centre for Sustainable Development at Cambridge University, and they've sort of done very useful work on this complex issue of designing for sustainable development and how you put together design frameworks on the kind of questions you should be asking throughout the process. So there's good stuff out there that whether you're a building designer or an urban designer, or whichever area of the built environment you're going into, there's good reference material out there to help you with developing your design process. The last 10-15 minutes or so, I'm going to run through now an example. So we've been working on for the last 2 years, and this is for an eco-city, so-called Dongtan Eco-City in China. And it's on an island just off the coast of, in the estuary, just off of Shanghai. This is a view of Shanghai from the Pudong River looking across an area called Pudong, which 15-20 years ago was fundamentally rice paddy fields. So in 20 years they've gone from that to this, which includes the world's third tallest building and really sort of frenetic, pressurised lifestyle and environment. Our client has been gifted a large area on this island of Chongqing, in the mouth of the Yangtze River, and they've been gifted or given effectively by the national government there as not land, but they developed it as an eco-city. So the client, the Shanghai Industrial Investment Corporation, came to us and said, what the hell is an eco-city and how do we design one? They had several design competitions, master plan competitions, that sort of ranged from ideas of garden cities through to the other extreme high density super tech cities, but there was nothing really that really grabbed them. They liked bits of various things that weren't convinced that any of the master plans would actually give them what they wanted. So we were lucky really to win a commission to review the last master plan they had, do a critique and start sort of defining for them really what an eco-city or what a sustainable city should be or what it should aspire to be. So the whole site is something like 86 square kilometres, and over time, over the next sort of up to 50 years, they're looking for the development there that will provide homes and jobs for around 400,000 people. Just to give you an idea of the speed and how much they're expanding. I think, as I mentioned earlier, our client has been quite enlightened in that they realise that China can't continue to develop the way that it has been, and they do need this new sort of ecological imperative really, and to do things differently and more efficiently. And previously, a lot of their master plan work has been based around having large areas of housing in one area, an industrial part of the city over here, huge 5-6 lane motorways connecting everything, and communities become fragmented and the whole sort of social fabric falls to pieces. So they really wanted something different here. So this is the site at the east end of the island, and one of the main constraints was the fact that there's an internationally recognised wetland here for migrating birds going to and from Siberia and Australasia. So there's a very significant environmental constraint on the site. And in the early work we did with the client, we sort of developed this idea of an eco-city, and basically went through each of the components of the city and identified sort of targets and the kind of design process that we should go through to get this new city effectively to work in a more sustainable way. So we ran a series of workshops out in Shanghai and developed, really went through the process that I described earlier, set out a series of objectives, and really from day one the client made it quite clear that they wanted to be at that far end of the spectrum, in that their vision was for to be a global market-leading eco-city. So they were all about 100% carbon neutral buildings, transport, from day one. That was the design brief. So it was quite a challenge that was set. We produced a series of initial sustainability targets to do with having the right land use mix to provide job opportunities. So it wasn't just all about housing, it wasn't just all about having a university site, it wasn't all just about sort of commercial offices. So a range of targets for social economics. In terms of energy and transport, as I said, the client wants the city to be carbon neutral from day one. So to get anywhere near that, it needs a huge reduction, 2/3 reduction in energy use from sort of business as usual in China, Shanghai at the moment. The same for transport, carbon neutral transport system, zero tailpipe emissions, etc., etc. So there's some very, very demanding targets. Similar on the water side, big reductions in water use, so designing water efficiency into their buildings and irrigation and everything else is critical. And on the ecology side, because of the wetland, as I mentioned, on the eastern edge of the site, we developed a sort of a strategy where we've got 3 zones of sort of a critical wetland area with absolutely no development in that whatsoever, then a very wide buffer space where there can be limited development of sort of visitor sort of eco-tourism facilities, very low key, and then the actual urban area itself. I mean, these numbers are things that designers can actually start designing to, and you can check, what is the area of green roof, what is the area of landscape park and everything else. If you set targets on the outset that you want to achieve, you can continually refer back to see whether you're achieving them. So some fairly simple, straightforward design principles we've set out with things like making sure that everybody lived ideally within 500 metres of a park or somewhere where they could go out, walk the dog, go running and what have you. And the drawing there shows there's an existing field structure which we didn't want to change and get involved in huge earth movements to sort of re-engineer the whole site. So from the outset, we sort of worked with the site as it is, and used the existing field structure and started sort of joining the park areas up together, so they sort of work from an ecological point of view. So really, before there were any roads or buildings or anything else, we sort of started with the green spaces and made sure they work and are joined together and link with the surrounding area. Then started looking at the building plots and how the buildings might work in terms of orientation and whether they work within this sort of 500 metre long sort of urban block, really, making sure they work from an orientation and shading point of view. Lots of analysis of sun path. There's also an existing water sort of landscape of existing rivers and canals, which again we want to change significantly, albeit designing around water features and having a sort of fairly large water feature in the middle provides a central hub for this first part of the city that we started to design. And because people generally tend to like to live near water, that starts to improve land values, puts greater value on the properties, etc., etc. So just some site analysis looking at sun paths and developing the water infrastructure that was there to really improve the value of the site. Shanghai is one of the probably the 5 or 6 top cities in the world at risk of flooding. It's a fairly low-lying area. The risk of climate change, increasing sea level, and the impact of sort of typhoons and storm surges is quite significant for that whole region. So, having a flood risk strategy, flood protection strategy was a key part of it. And we developed a series of flood cells. So each of this first part of the city is sort of designed around 3 main villages, each within its own flood cell, and then there's a large flood protection barrier around all 3 of them. So then, starting to get into a bit more detail, looking at how the green spaces work in the landscape. So there's a series of interconnecting parks, but then there are also private gardens and green routes. So the green space network works throughout the city to allow certainly not huge hordes of elephants and what have you wander through the city, but smaller animals and birds and what have you, rather than just having pocket handkerchief parks that are of no great ecological value. Having them joined together spatially really improves the ecological sort of nature of things. Looking at the land use, so making sure we've got a diversity of commercial space and residential and workplaces and etc. So people don't have to walk, don't have to travel too far. Looking with this three village concept and sort of a town centre, making sure that within each of the 3 villages, everybody can get to the main sort of resources they need, whether it's the library, the doctor, the sort of local shop to buy a newspaper, what have you. But all of those things are within, ideally, sort of 400 to 500 metres, and in some cases out to 800 metres or around 10 minutes walk. Again, looking to reduce the need for people to travel and to jump in their cars and go anywhere. We then start overlaying the other sort of more technical aspects to do with the road network and infrastructure, and making sure there are public transport stops, again within ideally 5 minutes walk of people's homes, to try and encourage them to use public transport and not their own cars. And thinking about new ways of designing sort of our road networks. In the UK, we really struggle with rat runs, and people, when the main roads are blocked, people start going through local neighbourhoods and streets where the kids are playing or what have you. So actually trying to design the access network in a way to discourage people and from just driving through and keeping them to the main roads is a real issue from a social point of view, and making sure our sort of local neighbourhoods are safe for children and people to be outside. The main pedestrian cycle network, certainly trying to keep that in a way separate from some of the larger roads where we've got public transport, and getting people to have access to green spaces where they can walk and cycle along the side of water features. From the energy side, we developed a strategy with a principal energy provider coming from combined cooling, heating and power plant, which uses biomass. So the waste from the rice industry locally, and all the husks that come off the rice plants are contained and barged to the site and then burnt, which then is used to produce heating and electricity and cooling. And that's done in combination with a small amount of anaerobic digestion of waste and some large wind turbines. Just a few numbers at the end here, just really trying to summarise what we achieved over the business as usual case. So in terms of sort of density and the amount of jobs, which is so keep banging on about, reducing the need for people to travel. From a conventional city approach of the previous master plans that have been done, they would have provided facilities for around 50,000 people to live there in this first part of the city, as I say, and developed around 90,000 jobs. From the work we've done and the master plan we've developed, we think we can get around 80,000 people on there, so living at a higher density, but using a lot less resources than the 50,000 people would have done, and at the same time producing a lot more jobs, so people can live and work a lot more locally to where they live. In terms of the EVO footprint, Shanghai there on the left is around 7.5 global hectares per person, so very unsustainable lifestyles in downtown Shanghai. Beijing slightly better, just over 4. And then we've done a series of assessments on Dongtan, with the first one on the right, with everything built out as we hope it will be, and then governed in a good, sustainable way, and people are actually living more sustainably. And we're down to about 2.6, 2.7. So still not at the 1.8 or 2 that we would ideally like to have got to. And the big issue there, whilst we've worked on the sort of transport and reducing the need to travel, and sort of reducing energy use in buildings and what have you, the big issue there is food and the production of food. And the areas that are needed for food are massively greater than the area that we have available here on the site. So there's still a big import of food going on, and that's really what impacts on our footprint. So the whole food issue, from a sustainability point of view, is massive and very critical. In terms of water consumption, water management, again, we've reduced both the consumption and the amount of sort of foul treated water that goes off the site, from the business as usual approach through sort of water efficiency measures of doing things differently, collecting rainwater and reusing that, etc. In terms of reducing emissions, firstly, huge reductions in energy demand because of better, more improved buildings, better levels of insulation, more efficient sort of energy generation methods, and the use of renewables, so huge reductions in CO2 emissions. Waste management. At the moment, there are very good levels of sort of waste recycling, really out of necessity across China. So whilst I guess we're trying to sort of build on that idea and that sort of practice that is in China at the moment, and just try and make things better, improve waste collection and recycling locally. In terms of transport, we recognise that in the early stages, there's no question people will be living there and will be commuting backwards and forwards to Shanghai, and that's really unavoidable. But over time, 5, 10, 15 years, as the city develops more, there will be less of a need for people to travel away. They can live and work more locally. So, over time, the amount of trips that people making should reduce. and then there'll be equivalent reduction in carbon emissions, pollution, improvements in air quality, etc. So our final slide, really, it's quite simple as it says there. There is no silver bullet. It's a complex thing. There's some huge challenges facing us, not just in this country. The impact of sort of China and India and the way they're developing, are huge issues. What I would just hope you would take away is that we need to design better. We need to work better in a more integrated way if we're going to start addressing some of these challenges. So, whatever you're going to be doing, whether it's building designers or architects or master planners, don't please just sit in your silo and do your thing. Sustainable development is about the process, having an open mind, and starting to deal with other disciplines other than yours. Do sort of grasp it, head for those, the global market leader kind of targets of zero carbon and huge reductions in water and recycling and everything else. Aim for those, push your clients to achieve those things, and work hard with your other colleagues, architects, etc., to try and achieve them. That's it. Thanks very much.